that kind of thing going back and forth. We want to focus then tonight on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And let's start off with the participants. I want to talk about the Arab Muslims, the so-called Palestinian people. Now, there's been some, and it's documented, living in the land throughout all the ages, for the last 2,000 years, we might say. But there weren't that many of them. The bulk of the Arab Muslims started coming back about 100 years ago as the Jews started coming back. They started, the Jews hired them to do work,
Yep.
and they paid them better wages than they were getting in their own countries, and or under the treatment of the Ottomans, who controlled that whole Middle East for 400 years. So they started coming back when the Jews started coming back. They weren't there all that time either.
No, nothing more than a handful. Unless you think that we're so biased that we're really not sharing truth and reality, we would reference you to the book Innocents Abroad by Samuel Clemens. Mark Twain. He traveled in that throughout the land of Israel in the about 1870, right after the Civil War, and simply documented what he saw. He didn't go for that reason, but we can read what he. And in fact, whenever I take groups to Israel, I take clippings from his writings and we look at it. And he makes statements like, "We traveled all day and did not see a single human soul." So as a result of his writings, we know that there was no more than just a scattering of Arab Muslims and Arab Christians, by the way, that would have been in the land in this era. After that, a more recent book, and I believe it was in the early 80s, written by author by the name of Joan Peters. It's called From Time Immemorial. She methodically documents just what you...
right, and she's not Jewish and didn't start out to take the Jewish position. She wanted to see what was actually going on in a scholarly manner. Also, Ken, if you read any of the writings, you know, when you go to the wall in Jerusalem, the Western Wall, there's Robinson's Arch and Wilson's Place. These were British and American archaeologists starting in the 1830s through the 1850s, and they concluded the same thing in their writings. So this is nothing new. So we can say that there is some humanistic claim for the Muslim Arabs, the so-called Palestinian people, to have a claim to the land, because some of them have been there.
Some have been there, but there's simply the idea that there's some sort of a large indigenous population of Arab Muslims in the land.
Right, that have been there from time immemorial.
It's just simply not true.
Just simply not
scattering.
True.
Now let's reverse this and look at the Jewish claim to the land. Obviously, Bible and archaeology and every history associates the Hebrew people with the land of Israel. Abraham 4,000 years ago, David 3,000 years ago, Jesus 2,000 years ago. So there is an ancient tie of the Jewish people to the land. Now, how about, we talked about Arab families, John. How about Jewish families?
Just like the Arab families, there were a few Jewish families living in the land. They were mainly in 4 cities, Jerusalem, Hebron, Sfat, and Tiberias. There was a scattering of Jews throughout the country, but very small, mainly condensed in these 4 cities. So the Jewish claim on a humanitarian basis is about, let's say, the same as the Arab Muslim claim. But now you brought up a biblical claim, and this is a program that comes from a biblical point of view.
And obviously the biblical claim is absolutely ancient.
That's right.
And from our perspective as believers, that biblical claim is obviously very, very important to us. Now we want to now look at the modern conflict. We would say really beginning with Theodore Herzl, the first Zionist conference in 1897, there was a call of the Jewish people to return to the land of Israel. now we understand that there were some that preceded that.
Right. So they were there, started in Gershom Solomon's grandfather, great-grandfather came in the 1840s. So there were Jews coming back, but really the 1880s was the great aliyot, mainly from Russia, and so the Jews started coming back. And they really increased in the 20th century. By the time Israel became a state in 1948, there were about 750,000 Jews, and today there's some 5.5 to 6 million living in the land of Israel. So they've been building up continuously. Now, almost from the very beginning, or we might say from the very beginning, because Gershom Solomon's grandfather, or great-grandfather rather, was strong for the Temple Mount, and he was murdered by Arabs. So this conflict's been going on for 160, 170 years in the land. Certainly the last 100 it's increased. We know there was a tremendous massacre. I said one of the cities that Jews lived in was Hebron in 1929. A large amount of Jews were murdered, just murdered in riots in Hebron, and the rest fled. From there. We know that in the 40s, up to 48, immigration to Israel was blocked by the British. In 48, then the nation was founded. There was the War of Independence. We visited a place called Gush Etzion, where prisoners, captured prisoners, were just hand grenades were thrown in the room, just murdered. So this conflict has been going on.
And it continues. Throughout the life of the modern state of Israel, we have the War of Independence that John mentioned in 1948. We have the Sinai War in 56, the Six-Day War in 67, the Yom Kippur War in 73, the War in Lebanon in 82, and so in every case of conflict, the Israelis were able to beat back their attackers and prevail, and as a result of that, the Arab Muslims eventually began to change strategy.
Yeah, well, they knew they couldn't defeat Israel militarily, even though they had them vastly outnumbered. Actually, you know, those 750,000 there in War of 48, 5 Arab nations attacked.
Right.
And so the numbers were always way out of proportion in favor of the Muslims. Israel always prevailed. So the new strategy then was this intifada, or uprising, where it would be like a war of attrition. And so the first intifada was about 1987 to about 1993, and that was an uprising with rocks. The Palestinians were throwing stones, huge stones, through the windows of cars as they passed by, and so that was a problem. After 93, in the Oslo Accords, the Israeli government, I don't know, they must have had a brain drought there, did something extremely foolish. They armed the Palestinians. They just did it again, unfortunately.
By the way, the United States is sending those same arms too.
I mean, it's ridiculous. They armed the Palestinians with the PA, Arafat's group, where Arafat's group would fight the terrorists. Arafat's group are the terrorists. So the PA, it's good cop, bad cop. They're the same people doing the same thing. It's just a fight now to see who will lead the intifada against Israel. So now there's an intifada with rifles, mortars, suicide bombers, every day, and you don't read about it, every day from Gaza, where the Israelis were forced to evacuate, carried off by their own government. There are Katyusha rockets hitting Israeli cities, Ken.
And that's true. Now, but the strategy of the Palestinians, and it is succeeding to a large degree. The strategy was to change the whole mindset relative to Israel and the Palestinians, and to portray the Palestinians as a poor, oppressed people under Israeli military occupation. Israeli became the big giant that was Goliath and the
because
Palestinians.
they're superior militarily, so they'll beat the population rather than an army.
And the Palestinians are being portrayed as the David, and the propaganda machine across the world is operating to do that, and to a large degree succeeding. The most recent contribution to that was former President Carter's book, Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid. He is obviously attempting to draw a parallel between in the Israeli-Palestinian thing with the South African thing of a couple of decades ago. And fortunately, Mr. Carter has been challenged on this from a lot of different sources. He should be challenged. It's an outright lie, and he's an instrument of lying propaganda.
Yeah. Documented also was millions of Saudi Arabian Arab money funneled to Mr. Carter for his library and his heritage. Mr. Carter is bought and sold. So now, or just bought, I should say.
Well,
anyway, beyond this now, so this is the conflict going back and forth. But beyond this, we believe from a biblical perspective that God is involved, that God is behind the scenes involved in this conflict. And we want to look at some scripture to indicate this, Ken.
Let me inject a thought here. Now, when we say that God is involved, and we're going to read some scriptures that specifically state that, by the way, the original calling of Abraham, and hence his descendants, which would be the modern Israelis, they were to be a blessing to all the nations of the world. Now God has called them back into the land in order to be that blessing. And for God's blessing to flow, now we might say, a lot of people talk about God's blessing flowing to America, but even if God's blessing ever has the chance of flowing to the Palestinians, it will be as a result of the Israelis in the land. And from a biblical perspective, and as believers, and you're watching the program tonight, we presume that you are a Christian believer for the most part. That's an essential thought. We have to deal with that.
Absolutely. The covenant that God made with Abraham was passed to Isaac, and then to Jacob, and then to the Jewish people. So it didn't matter what other children Abraham might have had here and there. The covenant went from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob, and that's where it went. Let's look at Ezekiel 37. That's the valley of dry bones where, as Ezekiel's going off into captivity, God reveals to him that the nation of Israel dried up and dead at the time, and for the last 2,600 years would come back to life. And this is what he says in verse 14. And I will put my spirit within you, and you will come to life, and I will place you on your own land. Then you will know that I, the Lord, have spoken and done it, declares the Lord. So God was saying, listen, you're going off into captivity. In that captivity, there wasn't a full regathering for the time of Jesus. That captivity lasted the 2,600 years till the last century, when the Jewish people started coming back. He also says in Jeremiah 16, this is a tremendous scripture, starting in verse 14. Therefore, behold, days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will when it will no longer be said, as the Lord lives, who brought up the sons of Israel out of the land of Egypt. But as the Lord lives, who brought up the sons of Israel from the land of the north, and from all the countries where he had banished them. For I will restore them to their own land, which I gave to their fathers. Now, every year Passover's been celebrated. Jesus celebrated. The Last Supper's Passover. It's been celebrated since Moses led the Israelites out. And God was known as the God of the Passover. Here he says he's going to do something that's going to be more spectacular than leading them out of Egypt. He's going to bring the Jews back from all the lands where they were scattered. That also happened. We see that culminating in 1948 and still ongoing, Ken, as Jews are returning.
Still happening, and we would say that it seems obvious to us, and we visited the land on many occasions, and it seems obvious to us that the hand of God is upon the Israeli people to prosper them, and God's judgment is upon those that would oppose it, whoever they happen to be. And in this particular case, we know them as the Palestinians.
So just as Israel won all those wars, Israel's going to continue to be supernaturally blessed by God, and the opposition to Israel, which is really opposition to God, is going to get more and more dire.
Yes, it is. And now in the days of Joshua, God commanded that they be utterly wiped out. But that's not the purpose today. We think that there's something God's doing that demands a good deal of discernment, and especially for real believers, that we believe that God is the Palestinian situation is going to continually worsen as God's favor continues to be on the blessing upon the Israelis, and that the Palestinians are going to serve as a lure. We know from the scriptures that we're coming to a final conflict, and that this Palestinian situation is going to serve as a lure to the nation.
You know, Ken, we're not going to read it tonight, but in Joel 3, the 3rd chapter of the book of Joel, God says at the time that he restores Jerusalem and Israel as a nation, he's going to bring all the nations down to the valley of Jehoshaphat and enter into judgment with them there, because they've scattered his people and divided up his land. So that's why we say God is involved. All the nations are growing more and more against Israel, and more favoring the Arabs because of oil and the sheer numbers of the Muslims. And so but we see God's hand behind the whole thing, Ken.
Certainly is the case. And again, it's something that demands discernment. Again, that's one of the reasons why we take people to Israel, with groups going up from time to time, because you really need to be there and allow your heart to be discerning of what's happening, and it becomes much more evident. The situation, we're confident that the Palestinian situation is going to grow increasingly worse. The Israeli position is going to grow increasingly stronger. And the world in general, the media, and many, if not most, political leaders around the world are going to continue to stack up on the side of the supporting of the Palestinians. We talked about Secretary of State Rice pressuring Israel, going to Ramallah, demanding a Palestinian state. The quartet is going to demand the same thing. And we believe, as John cited from the book of Joel, that the nations are being drawn down into the valley where God is judgment. Now, John, read this scripture from Zechariah chapter 3. Chapter 12, I'm sorry. He specifically says that in the end time, Jerusalem is going to be a heavy stone.
Behold, I'm going to make Jerusalem a cup that causes reeling to the peoples around. And when the siege is against Jerusalem, it will also be against Judah. And it will come about in that day, I will make Jerusalem a heavy stone. For all the peoples and all who lift it will be severely injured, and all the nations of the earth will be gathered against it. Now, we heard of Armageddon. It's in Revelation 16:16. We'll see God's judgment is coming on the earth, starting in Revelation 6, culminating in the Battle of Armageddon. And so that's God behind it, getting ready to judge the earth, and he's going to judge them as they surround Jerusalem.
That's exactly right. Two things. They scattered my people, he said, and divided up my land. And the policy of the United States has been for a long time to divide up the land of Israel, to form a Palestinian state. Absolutely contrary to any kind of logic whatsoever in this so-called war on terrorism. Nevertheless, our nation, our official policy is pressing toward the formation of an Islamic terrorist state right in the heartland of Israel, including Jerusalem.
Now, believers need to take note of what's happening, Ken. And, you know, just because it's a conservative president leading it, we can't go blindly in following them behind them.
Absolutely not. Let me make this statement again. We're delighted that Christians would tune in and study with us in these programs, which we do week for week. But I received a letter recently from a leading rabbi in Israel, and he was rejoicing at our support. But he said concerning America, if there is a hope for America, it will come from real believing Christians who see and discern what's happening and stand up for America. I happen to love this country. I served in the military, as did John. I think of a Norman Rockwell America, America of my childhood. I pray that this nation is spared from the ultimate judgment. I'm afraid with the political leadership that we have that we're not going to be spared.
Well, this is the time for Christians to identify with Israel as the age draws to a conclusion. Well, that's our program for this evening. Shalom.